For this next session of the Covering Rare Diseases Fellowship Program, we're going to build on the incredible presentation we just saw from Dr. Eric Green of the National Human Genome Research Institute. The incredible information we receive about where we are in terms of research is eye-opening and almost astonishing. But this next section will help us unpack exactly what, because the issue is, how do we move the needle on the gains that we've made, on the incredible research findings and the promise that this research holds? Our first speaker will be Dr. Joni L. Rutter. She's the acting director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the NIH. And she'll help us consider how we do that. She'll be followed by Annie Kennedy, who's the Chief of Policy and Advocacy of the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. And Annie will help us understand the economic impact of rare disease and how much it will cost us if we don't make some of these gains that are predicted. So welcome, Dr. Rutter, Annie Kennedy, and please take it away.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Rachel, for the invitation to be here today, and to the National Press Foundation. We need your help in telling the story, the 10,000 stories of rare diseases. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today, and how we're going to move the needle. So I am going to try to share my screen. So I'm going to tell you basically 5 different stories here about tackling rare diseases. And the first one I'm going to talk a little bit about is, hopefully I can move these slides. There we go. Why we need to move the needle on rare diseases. And I'm going to give you a variety of numbers here. So the numbers are that we have about 10,000 rare diseases that we know about. Now, you're going to hear a bunch of different numbers, I bet, throughout the next 3 days on how many rare diseases there are. I'm going to tell you that they're all probably right, but they're all probably not exact. And I'm going to tell you how we get to this number of 10,000. But with that number of 10,000 rare diseases, we only have about 500 treatments or cures for them. So that means 95% of these diseases don't have a treatment or a cure. And the issue that we're trying to grapple with is that the time it takes from early development to getting a compound to be tested in the lab to then into the medicine cabinets takes about 10 to 15 years. That's a long time. It also takes about $2.6 billion for it to get there. And then on top of that, about 90% of them fail to be safe and effective when they get into the clinic. And so we have to go back to the drawing board. So these are some pretty stark realities that we need to deal with in terms of developing treatments for rare diseases. And then the issue about understanding how many rare diseases there are, well, that's a whole other story too. Now, you just heard probably from Dr. Green from the National Human Genome Research Institute, our sister agency here at the NIH, and we're from NCATS, which is in the same NIH as NHGRI. And what we try to do is understand how we can make research observations into health solutions. And this is important because what Dr. Green just mentioned was the fact that we understand the molecular basis of about 6,000 to 7,000 of these rare diseases. So of the 10,000, about 6,000 to 7,000 of those are known, and from that molecular basis, we know what genes are involved in causing those diseases. And again, I'm just pointing out here in this diagram that there are just very few treatments available for those rare diseases. And again, so our mission at NCATS is to turn these research observations into health solutions by using something called translational science. So translational science means that we're tackling sort of these ongoing challenges in research so that new treatments can reach people faster. How can we understand the scientific, the operational, the administrative, and the all of these other hurdles that go into what it takes to move treatments forward into the clinic. And so we try to tackle those bottlenecks so that we can make that more efficient and more effective. And we focus on what's common across these diseases, especially focusing on rare diseases. And we develop solutions that can overcome those bottlenecks in this translational process. And our vision is a future of more treatments for all people more quickly. And what I want to bring to you today is that rare diseases are not rare. So it's a misnomer, but it's understandable. Rare diseases affect around 30 million people, or roughly 10% of the US population. And when you go worldwide, this is an estimate of 350 to 400 million people who suffer from rare diseases. Now, on top of that, we did a study out of our group that looked at rare diseases compared to people who don't have rare diseases and what they might experience in the healthcare system. And it turns out that individual medical costs for people with a rare disease are 3 to 5 times higher than those who don't have a rare disease. And when you consider that within the US, there are 25 to 30 million people with rare diseases, you can extrapolate that and you get to this number of around $400 billion of direct medical costs are required for rare diseases. And that's similar to that of cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. So there's an urgency here about rare diseases. And I've put the QR code in case you're interested in pulling up the publication that's the source of this particular information. Now, so one of the key goals for us is to shorten the rare disease diagnostic odyssey. We know that about 7,000 people have the known origins of disease, but yet it's still very difficult to highlight them in our medical healthcare system. And why is that? Well, it turns out that we have a variety of sources that have sort of, they try to cover the same information, but it turns out that most of it is different. And we have about 5 different databases that hold the number of rare diseases. And across these 5 different sources, when you add them all up, we see that there are about 10,577 unique rare disease concepts. Now that number still is changing. That's not a truly accurate number, but it's the closest that I think that we've gotten to. And it turns out across these 5 different sources, only about 333 are shared across all 5 of these concepts. So you have to really look across these different sources to really get a sense of the numbers of rare diseases. And again, I put a QR code for the reference for some of this kind of information in case you wanted to do a little bit more digging. So the exact number of rare diseases is really hard to determine. And in the US, this is true. And certainly when you look across countries, this is also true because different countries define rare differently. In the US, we look at an absolute prevalence of disease. And so people, less than 200,000 people who have that disease, that would be considered a rare disease in the US. In Japan, it's less than 50,000. In South Korea, it's less than 20,000. And some examples in other countries, they look at percentage prevalence. So in the European Union, for example, it's fewer than 1 in 2,000 people who have a rare disease. And in Australia, 1 in 20,000 people have a rare disease. So these are a few countries that have examples of how they're defining what rare diseases are. And then there are several countries that don't really have a definition in legislation. And so that's why it's been very difficult to really understand the numbers of rare disease that we're really thinking about. So when we talk about prevalence and we talk about the numbers of diseases, and we talk about these costs, these are probably underestimates, but they're ballpark estimates that we can figure out based on the data that we have. So the other key piece, and Dr. Green alluded to this earlier, is that we're finding new rare diseases each year. About over 200 of those are being found each year because we have the technological capability to do whole genome sequencing in individuals who may have a rare disease. And so that's the whole point of the Undiagnosed Disease Network. And then we also have the newborn screening program that's been extraordinarily valuable for helping to find people with rare diseases and get them diagnosed sooner. So these are some of the issues that we're looking at. And then finally, I wanted to point out that rare diseases are not defined in the same way across these systems. So not only are they defined, the definitions of prevalence are different, how they're defined within our medical systems are even different. So dozens of disease registries exist, but they each have their own way of naming the rare diseases. And they're also, rare diseases are not as well included in our standard clinical terminologies. For example, the International Classification of Disease Codes that we often use for our health systems. So definitions of rare diseases are not really interoperable in how we're able to use them. And again, this makes it very difficult to find or to see these rare disease individuals within our healthcare systems. And on the right-hand side, I'm just showing a list of an example of a rare disease called 11-beta hydroxylase deficiency. And in our GARD research database, we have tried to collect all of the different names that are mentioned that refer to this particular disease. And it turns out for this one, there are 9 different names for one disease. And even if we just know the genomic the genomic underpinning of that disease, for example, the one on the bottom, 12q14 microdeletion syndrome, we have even 4 different names for that one disease. So these are some of the problems that we're trying to tackle now, and how we can converge on our naming of rare diseases so that we can start to see individuals within our healthcare systems much more effectively and efficiently. So the issue about this really then lends itself to how difficult it is to identify rare disease patients. And so they experience what's called the diagnostic odyssey. So despite the fact that there are 10% of the population having a rare disease, our ability to count them is really difficult. We have the lack of clear definitions. And that means that the high quality evidence to guide treatments is very scarce within our purview. And very few expert centers are available for diagnosing and managing and doing the research for those rare diseases. And so what happens then in practice is that patients often have to see multiple clinicians over a years long time before receiving an accurate diagnosis. And that's why it's called the diagnostic odyssey. So for us, we want to try to understand how we can address this particular issue using electronic health record databases. And so we have an opportunity here. And it turns out that in medical school, what's being taught is that when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras, because oftentimes people come in with a more common disease. It's not often the rare disease. However, we want to change that adage. It's not a bad adage, it's a good adage, but we want to change it to think about when you think about a person that's sitting in front of you who has symptoms, maybe think about a zebra when their medical records show that they may be young, because we do know that 50% of rare diseases often present at very early childhood, or perhaps they've been seeing the same physician several times, and so there's high utilization of the clinical care, or they've seen multiple physicians across even different states or across the country, because they've been wanting to find different specialists who might be able to help them. So these are some of the factors that we're seeing in electronic health record systems that might tell us that perhaps you might have a rare disease patient in front of you rather than a patient with a common disease. And so we're highlighting ways in which we can use these sorts of electronic health record systems to help assist physicians on how to diagnose them, but more tools are needed. And so one of the things that we're doing at NCATS, and here's a QR code in case you're interested in looking at this more, is to develop these tools. And so we have 3 different projects now that we're supporting. One is using electronic health records to shorten the diagnostic odyssey. What they're doing is they're taking electronic health records, they're identifying the rare diseases within those electronic health records, and then they're developing algorithms to identify those rare diseases, and then they're testing them and honing them and seeing if they can go back and identify those rare diseases based on that particular algorithm that they've generated. And then they will ultimately test that in other systems as well to make sure that it does work. So this is what's happening starting out in New York, and then it will expand to other health systems. And if it's very effective, then we can try to implement that more commonly. In addition, there are groups that are looking at machine-assisted tools to help clinicians identify early clinical evaluation of specific rare diseases and disorders. And so they're addressing different stages within the electronic health record to put these tools in the systems to help clinicians identify them. And then what was talked about previously, it is the idea of genomics. And so another platform is to develop a way to identify those who are medically underserved in the Texas area, and identify those individuals who may need to be sequenced or do whole genome sequencing to find the rare diseases that may be impacting them. So these are some of the tools that we're trying to impart for rare diseases. Now, newborn screening and the Undiagnosed Disease Network have been incredibly critical for the diagnostic odyssey. But that usually means that that's when the treatment odyssey starts. And so here's the next vignette, increasing the number of treatments for rare diseases. And the important thing here is that there, as I mentioned, over 7,000 that we know about of this molecular cause. About 85% of those are a single gene disorder. And I'm going to come back to this because this is an important point. And as I also mentioned, about 50% are onset in early childhood. But this idea about rare diseases not being rare is important too, because it turns out that there's very little commercial interest or market incentives to get industry or companies to develop treatments for rare diseases because there's no incentive for that. So how can we try to change that curve? Can we do something? Can we de-risk in a way platform approaches that might help incentivize more people to start to understand how we can bring treatments for rare diseases? And so there are different causes of rare diseases, and this issue about single gene disorders is the one I wanted to really focus on here. So on the left-hand side, as I mentioned, there's this graph with the purple lines here. And what's this showing is that as you go to the right-hand side on the bottom of that graph, you increase in prevalence. And then on the left-hand side is the number of diseases. But what I'm just trying to show here is that on that left-hand side, most of the rare diseases have a very low prevalence. So that there might be just 10 people or maybe even 100 people with that particular rare disease. And so finding them within the US is hard, and we can make that easier if we can go across the globe and find rare diseases across the globe, because then we might be able to expand and increase the number of those rare diseases and help us really find those opportunities for bringing treatments for those rare diseases. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about gene therapies for rare diseases, because I think this is really where we have a lot of promise. Most of the rare disease treatments we have right now are in small molecules, shown in this pie chart. And there are others like medical foods or surgeries, for example, and then there are antibodies as well. But there's a little sliver here on cell and gene therapies, and that's where I want to focus on next. So in terms of gene therapies, the whole idea is to really think about how we can use adeno-associated viral vectors for infecting cells with a therapeutic gene that the rare disease is missing, or it's not functional in that particular person. So when we can take an adeno-associated virus, it has its own DNA, and if it infects a cell, that DNA is programmed to then make more viruses, and that's what happens here at the top. But in gene therapy, what we're trying to do is we remove the DNA of the virus and we replace it with the therapeutic gene, and then we use the virus to deliver the therapeutic gene into the patient's cells. And this is really an incredible way in which we can develop platforms of this adeno-associated viral vectors to then create these gene therapies that might be able to help a large number of those rare diseases. And there are different subtypes of these AAV vectors, and they infect different cells, different cell types or cell targets. And so we can use specific AAVs to infect specific cells depending on what the disease is actually causing. And so there's a program that we have at the NIH that NCATS is leading called the Accelerating Medicines Partnership or Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium. It's also known as BGTC. And essentially, the idea is to develop adeno-associated viral vectors as delivery vehicles as a platform for a variety of genes that can be delivered to these target cells. And so the idea here is the first idea is to really create the biology underlying the therapeutic of the AAV vectors, and then increase the efficiency by orders of magnitude to really enhance the therapeutic gene expression within those viral vectors to hopefully reduce some of the toxicities and increase the efficacy of gene therapies as we go forward. Now, the other key thing about this particular program is that we also want to figure out how to streamline the vector generation process, and so that you can have the applications that are not a series of one-offs but that we're really able to democratize this process and make it available for a variety of different groups to use. And by doing so, it allows us to do better in vector generation, in vector manufacturing, and then the regulatory oversight as well. We're designing this sort of process and delivery menu so that you can have a template that will be available for researchers who can then apply and adopt this approach to as many diseases that are amenable to gene therapies. And so that's the whole goal behind the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium. And we're collaborating with a variety of partners, including the FDA, as well as over a dozen different industry and patient organizations, as well as a handful or a dozen of different institutes and centers within the NIH. So that's from the treatment side. Now I want to end up here talking a little bit too about the idea of how we can bring these therapeutics to treatments and cures for patients in the clinic. And for this, again, because of the rare nature of specific rare diseases, we need to find patients as best as possible. And so we really need to join hands across the globe to maximize our ability to find individuals with rare diseases that we can affect. So one of the programs that we have at NCATS is called the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, or RDCRN. And here we're looking at a sort of a many diseases at a time approach. We're looking at 20 rare disease research groups, and they each focus on at least 3 related diseases, because we want to try to find what's common across these diseases and then understand how we can develop therapies for them. And in this way, we're able to share costs and find uniform studies for data collection, hopefully start to harmonize those data as well, and making meaningful large-scale natural history studies possible that will then lead us into the clinic. And here we're also very much directly engaging with patients and researchers across the globe and training new researchers as well. We now have 273 clinical sites across the country and even more across the world. And we're working as well with affiliated patient organizations as well. And so I encourage you to take a look a little bit more at the RDCRN network for that global representation of the rare disease network. I want to end on just a few resources for patients and patient advocates that I wanted to point you to. We have something that catalogs the different rare diseases that are out there here at NCATS. And this is a complimentary website that there are many other websites as well, but GARD, Genetics and Rare Disease Information Center, is one of them. You can find about diseases, you can find out about clinical trials and any treatments that might be available, and also patient registries. We have a toolkit for patient-focused therapy development to help educate patients and patient families on how to find researchers who might be working on their disease or diseases of interest. And then lastly, we have something called the RADAR, Rare Disease Registry Program, which is how patients can find different registries that they might be interested in joining. So these are a variety of tools in our toolkit that are available for patient advocacy groups and researchers as well. So with that, these are the major steps that we're trying to take in order to improve the lives of rare disease patients. And with that, we can have, I hope, a better information on research priorities in diagnostic and treatments for rare diseases through this coordinated research and disease understanding, developing better methods and accelerating the diagnoses for improving the diagnostic accuracy. And that's how also we're going to accelerate the treatment development with more precise data and platform-based approaches as well. And so in the decade ahead, I hope that earlier graph I showed you with the 500 rare disease therapies will really start to turn that curve. And in the next decade ahead, will dramatically increase the number of therapies that are available for rare diseases. That's the aspiration. That's the goal. More treatments for all people more quickly. And I want to end here too. If you don't know about it, Rare Disease Day at the NIH is February 28th, 2023. And I hope you can join in and listen in. This is a wonderful day to learn a lot about rare diseases and hear patient stories. And so I encourage you to attend. The QR code is here in case you're interested in signing up. So thank you very much for listening. And I want to now take a moment to introduce my colleague, Annie Kennedy, who is the Chief of Policy Advocacy and Patient Engagement at the EveryLife Foundation. So Annie, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Rutter. I love presenting Dr. Rutter and I have an opportunity to do this actually pretty often. So it's wonderful when we get to present together. I'm going to try and share my screen. Make sure everybody can see it. Okay, you're seeing it? Wonderful. Just by way of introduction, I'm Annie Kennedy, and I have the honor of getting to help represent our rare disease patient community and the EveryLife Foundation. And we are a coalition of stakeholders, largely patients and patient advocacy organizations in the rare disease community. And Dr. Rutter did such a beautiful job framing some of the priorities of the rare disease community. I'm just going to dig in a little bit deeper to some of those that she highlighted. So just some of the data that already was brought up, but just in some additional context. Rare diseases are not rare, as Dr. Rutter said. And some of the data that I'll go through a little bit further, there are between 7,000 and 10,000 known rare diseases, and we are actually leading an effort with many of our federal agency and other coalition stakeholders to update that data. We are an evidence-based policy organization, so we're really committed to developing evidence that informs the policy efforts, that inform decisions that drive legislation and policy. We also see ourselves as the individuals who make sure that some of the experts you're hearing from today who are helping move the needle for rare diseases have the resources that are needed to do that. So you're hearing from many of our wonderful partners, including leaders here at NIH, who need more tools. So several times you heard Dr. Rutter talk about, we need more tools to do this. Well, those tools include federal funding resources. Those tools include infrastructure, and I'm going to talk about some of the infrastructure we have here in the US that needs to be enhanced and modernized to meet the growing needs of our rare disease community. And our community, in addition to doing policy, actually, we come together and lead advocacy efforts, so legislative efforts and efforts with members of Congress to drive appropriation resources and legislative efforts to help modernize the system, provide resources to those like Dr. Green, and you'll hear from Dr. Gall later, so that we can move these needles forward. But it's patients and patient communities who come together that provide those resources for many of these research and public health initiatives. This number, 30 million, we believe is a conservative underestimate for a lot of the reasons Dr. Rutter mentioned. So this 7,000 to 10,000 number is probably an underestimate, and also because of that coding issue that Dr. Rutter talked about, that ICD code or those classification codes. We like to think of them as sort of a hashtag, and you get them for all of the reasons you go to the doctor, whether you go for high blood pressure or you go for a pregnancy. Every time you have a medical encounter, there's a code for that encounter, but most rare diseases do not have codes. So you're not coded, you're not tracked for the rare disease that you're being treated for, you're invisible in the system. So as an example, during the COVID pandemic, we couldn't look at what the higher incidence or prevalence was for those with rare diseases who were contracting COVID or have symptoms now from long COVID, because we can't look at cross-track that COVID and most rare diseases because we can't track rare diseases in health records. So that's a real issue for us in the rare disease community. But with the data that we have been doing a lot of evidence to really look at what the economic impact is in rare diseases. And I'm going to pull some of that data forward for you now. And we've been working with the community to really develop that evidence. As Dr. Rutter said, we know that more than 50% of the rare diseases are pediatric onset, and fewer of them have FDA-approved therapies. So there is a huge unmet need in rare disease and tremendous urgency in our community. And a study that the EveryLife Foundation led with our rare disease community and partners demonstrated, was published last year, demonstrated that in 2019, so before the pandemic, the economic impact of living with a rare disease in the US was $1 trillion. It was 1 year of cost. 60% of those costs were incurred directly by families and society. So it was 40%, less than half of the cost for those that came from direct costs, meaning costs to the medical system. So the majority of costs, if you receive a medical diagnosis of a rare disease, are going to be shouldered directly by families, not the medical system. We need to look at ways to streamline those costs, reduce those costs, and shift them. So our policy priorities here at the foundation fall into 3 buckets. I'm going to just focus on a couple of them for the sake of time, but eliminating the diagnostic odyssey for rare disease patients. And a number of the presenters today are going to talk about a number of the innovations in that space. And I'm just going to give you a few perspectives through the patient community as to why that's so important. Closing the innovation gap for the 95% of rare disease communities who have no FDA-approved treatment. Dr. Rutter already just did a beautiful job of talking about opportunities we have in the pipeline and why additional resources and the policy work we do is so critical to make sure that we do move the needle and realize those opportunities, and facilitating timely access to approved therapies. I once had a family call me after the first approval had been granted by the FDA in their child's disease space. And she had a son who was diagnosed with that rare disease. And she said, I used to think that the worst thing was having a child who had a fatal diagnosis for which there was no approved treatment. And she said, I now know I was wrong because there now was an approved treatment in her child's disease, but she couldn't get access to that treatment. It was being denied coverage by her health insurance company. She said, now the worst thing is having a child who has a diagnosis that is fatal, knowing that there's an approved therapy and being denied access to that approved therapy. So one of the things we work on as a community is providing data and evidence to ensure that there is access to approved therapies so that no parent should face that, no adult should face that. So just as far as diagnostic odyssey, just some information that will provide additional context for some of the other speakers you're hearing from today. You're going to hear a lot about whole genome sequencing today, those are initiatives that we are proud to be a part of. I'm going to focus then for that reason on newborn screening today, which is a part of our public health system and is right now the way many of those in our community are identified or have opportunities to be identified for their rare diseases. Just a little bit about our current newborn screening system. Our newborn screening system, if you have ever had a baby in the US healthcare system, when you had your baby within the first 24 hours in the hospital or with your midwife had a heel prick, just a little blood stick in the hospital. 4 million newborns experience that every year, and about 1 in 3 has a condition that can be detected through newborn screening. Newborn screening also includes a hearing test and a congenital heart test. Newborn screening saves lives. Right now, though, in the US system, we have a system where conditions are nominated federally to a committee that's overseen by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. The conditions are reviewed by that committee, and then that committee makes recommendations to the states. States then have their own individual processes as to whether or not conditions are added at the state level. So we have in the US a system in which different states screen for different conditions. And the conditions for which your baby is screened for depend on where your baby is born. We, in that survey I was talking about, the National Economic Burden of Rare Disease Study, conducted a survey and included questions. We worked with the Undiagnosed Diseases Network, and you'll hear from Dr. Gall later today, who established that network, to better understand what the diagnostic odyssey in rare disease was. And Dr. Rutter talked about this diagnostic odyssey. And of our survey respondents, the average diagnostic odyssey for someone with rare diseases was 6.3 years. So those are people whose conditions are not on the newborn screening panels or not being screened for, or have conditions that can't be yet detected at birth, of adult onset conditions or later onset conditions. And that diagnostic odyssey further included 16.9 medical specialists. So those are over 6 years and 17 specialists of pain, expense, angst, and extreme agony. We can do better. Just a little bit more about the state-by-state disparity. So right now in the US, this is an updated map. We have about 36 conditions that are on the federal panel. Some states screen for fewer than 31 diseases. Some states screen for more than 60. So again, this conditions for which your newborn are screened for is dependent on the state in which you live. This is a circumstance in the patient community that we often refer to as death by zip code, because for a condition to be added to the newborn screening panel, it has to have an intervention that is considered life-altering or life-saving. So that means that the conditions that are not being screened for and not being offered have potentially life-altering or life-saving therapies sitting on the shelves. So what happens if you're in a state that's not screening for all of the conditions? I'll give you an example. These are Christina and Ada. This is a mother who, during the Zika outbreak, Zika crisis, was living in Florida. She was pregnant and realized that her risk during her pregnancy of living in Florida was too high. So she moved to Illinois, which is where her family was from, to complete her pregnancy and deliver her baby. And when she delivered her baby in Illinois, she moved to a state that was actually screening for a condition that Florida was not. So when she delivered her baby received the newborn screening panel in Illinois, and her baby was screened for and received the diagnosis of Pompe disease. Her baby then received within a week a treatment for Pompe and is now a very healthy little girl. That would not have happened in Florida because at the time, Florida had not yet added Pompe to the screening panel. John and Kate, this is an even more recent example. John just testified at our congressional caucus briefing just a couple of weeks ago. He and his wife actually live here in the DC area. And you can imagine here in the DC area, many of us work in DC, but live either in Maryland or Virginia. Depending on whether you deliver your baby at Sibley or Fairfax or Holy Cross, you will have your child screened on 3 different panels, depending on where you deliver. Kate was born about 9 months ago. Kate was born just days before the state of Virginia implemented spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA, to the newborn screening panel. SMA, many of you have been following, is a disease that has had many advances made in that space and has a gene therapy that is considered to be a life-saving gene therapy. Kate was not identified through newborn screening. Kate had the typical clinical presentation of SMA and was diagnosed about 6 months later. Within days of her diagnosis, received gene therapy and is responding very well to the therapy, but will have a different outcome and a different trajectory of her disease than if she had been identified in newborn screening. What we hope is that Kate will be the last baby missed and the last child not identified through newborn screening in the state of Virginia. The goal, though, is that we have no more lasts, no more babies missed, and that when something is added to a federal panel, we immediately are able to add and close the gap in the state panels. But all too often, we have these disparities in the states. So this is just an overview, and for the sake of time, we'll just share slides and not go through them one by one, of the different efforts that we are a part of to move the needle and to ensure that individuals living with rare diseases are benefiting from today's innovations in the rare disease space. I'm just going to skip over this section because Dr. Rutter did a really great job talking about the opportunities in innovation, but we have so many hurdles that we must overcome to ensure that the promise in today's pipelines become reality for this generation of today's rare disease patient community. We have more innovation than we are currently able to fund. We have more clinical trial opportunities than we're able to move through regulatory pipelines. And we have more approvals than people are getting access to. And we need to make sure that those bottlenecks are alleviated. We also have challenges with what we refer to as the ultra rare disease communities. So the communities that are fewer than 500 need to ensure that we have clinical trials that are tailored to those patient communities and that we can evaluate the outcomes, the benefits of the products that are being developed from them so that those patients are also benefiting from today's innovations. We also have pathways that have been created to ensure that clinical trials can be designed to look for and detect nuanced changes in function, that are looking for what's happening in the biological changes in patients, and that we're detecting for disease before we see clinical symptom onset. Our goal as a society should be that we can detect for disease before symptom onset and that we can prevent disease progression. The accelerated approval pathway is a perfect example of that, and we know that it's working. And then I'll just wrap with these couple things. These are the results of our National Economic Burden of Rare Disease study. This is the data that I was referring to at the beginning, showing that the majority of the costs are being shouldered by families and our society. The cost drivers are not pharmaceuticals. The cost drivers are not the indirect, or they're not direct costs. They're not the physician visits. We can do better. We need to do better. We need to make sure that the resources and that these innovations are being applied. We need to make sure that patients are no longer invisible, and we need to be properly counting the rare disease patient community. We have a public health crisis of rare disease, and we've demonstrated during COVID that we can solve public health crises when we deploy all of the resources and are committed to solving for the crisis. Again, this is Ada, healthy, grown up, the product of rare disease innovation, when we've deployed solutions, detected disease immediately, and treated for an optimal outcome. And this is Kate, thriving, doing well. Again, we can and should continue to do better. And our goal at EveryLife and in the rare disease patient community is that we optimize health outcomes for this generation of children and adults living with rare diseases. We have the tools, and we need to ensure that those working within our communities, those experts leaning in, have the resources required to make sure that every individual living with a rare disease realizes its potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie. And I see that many of the questions that attendees had have been answered in the chat, which is marvelous. I'm so grateful you were able to do that. But I have one quick one, and we're near the end of our time, but I really feel like this might be a point that needs to be made. And that is it of value to sort of leverage the fact that money spent on rare disease research and time and effort spent on expanding that can have exponential benefits in other sectors as well in terms of treating other diseases? Annie first, and then Dr. Rutter, if you could wrap that up.
Yes, absolutely. I'll start, but I'll just tee it up to Dr. Rutter. I would say, first of all, many of the advances we've had in rare disease have immediately benefited other disease communities. The learnings we've had in our research has immediately benefited other communities. The other thing is, most people with rare diseases don't just have one rare disease, they have multiple rare diseases. And many of these diseases are also genetic. And so even though we're going to hopefully solve for the diseases, our goal is not to make them go away. Our goal is to be able to identify and treat them before people become symptomatic, so that even though you may inherit something, you won't be living with it. If you pass it down, you won't continue to live with it. So I just want to make that point as well. Dr. Rutter.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have much to add. I think I completely agree. And I'm so glad that you made this point, because with the approaches that we're taking in diagnostics and in therapeutics, absolutely we're focused on rare diseases because we think we can get a lot of traction here, and then just because rare diseases are not rare but somewhat rare, their support shouldn't be rare, and that's I think it's so critical to know that, because when we can identify diagnostics and therapeutics for rare diseases, that's going to also help us find diagnostics and therapeutics for common diseases as well, because common diseases have many sort of unique components in and of themselves too. And so I think that this is one of those key things that will actually lift all boats. But for rare diseases, this is the particular focus, because we think that we can make such great progress on all sides of diagnostics and therapeutics. And that's where we're going to get the start. And then we'll pull that thread through, I think, for implementing that for other diseases as well.
Annie Kennedy and Joni Rutter, we are so grateful to you for joining us for this conversation. And I hope that you both will be open to us reaching out to you in the future with more questions and for more advice from you on how to interpret and cover this issue. Thank you both so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.